very helpful to think of drug use in terms of spectrums, that it isn't just either you're addicted or you're not. It's a spectrum of ranging from completely non-problematic to very problematic use.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
Fake news is a term that gets thrown around way too liberally these days. Usually as a way to smear political opponents. But media does sometimes have a credibility problem, one that goes back as far as the days of yellow journalism. Journalists are only human, they make mistakes, and they often correct those mistakes. But when it comes to covering drugs, well, things often get hysterical, lack any scientific rigor or evidence, and the record rarely gets corrected. The media plays no small part in the war on drugs, which is really a war on people, and carries a lot of water for the prohibitionist movement, promotes stigma against people who use drugs, and unless it's cannabis or psychedelics, does little to promote the idea that drugs can be used responsibly. I'm Troy Farah, and you're listening to Narcotica. With me today are my Narcotica co-hosts Christopher Moraff and Zachary Siegel. We'll be talking with Will Godfrey, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Filter Magazine, a new online publication dedicated to drug education and harm reduction. It's in the hands of two very excellent editors, Helen Redman and Cecily Blanchard. Will has spent a decade in journalism covering drugs from a compassionate perspective. In full disclosure, both Chris and I freelance for Filter. Will has also edited tons of Zach's work over the years, so we all do work together. However, when we started Narcotica a year ago, one of our grandiose ideas was to expand into a journalism outlet that focuses on drugs, nothing else, and comes at drug policy from a scientific, drug users are human perspective. Because that kind of publication really didn't exist. Vice covers drugs that way most of the time, The Fix does a decent job now and then, but otherwise there really wasn't this totally drug-devoted publication that I was hoping for. Until Filter Magazine came along in September 2018. So of course I wanted to work for Filter. Chris also has a column there where he's written about the freelancer effect related to drug dealing, testing street drugs for fentanyl, and more. Today we're going to talk about drug literacy in media and what makes Filter Magazine unique. Will, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Troy. Pleasure to be with you.
Let's give some listeners some background on you, Will. When did you begin writing about drugs? And Filter is also not the first website dedicated to drug use that you've started. You were with The Influence, Substance.com, and you were editor-in-chief of The Fix for a while.
Yes, I have a sort of a long record of drug-related and criminal justice-related publications going back about 13 years now. Actually, the first publication I ever ran was in a prison in London where I worked in the education department, and I co-founded and edited a publication that was written by and for prisoners. And so my first editorial team consisted of people who had been convicted of a range of crimes. A lot easier in some ways than working with New York journalists, I must say. But that was really what sparked my passion for this field, working with those people and of course covering subjects that always intersected with drugs and drug policy. And it was impossible being in a prison not to notice the huge disparities and human rights abuses that disproportionately affect people of color and people from low-income backgrounds. And so I took it from there. And when I moved over to the States in 2010, I got a job working with The Fix. I held a number of positions there and eventually became editor-in-chief, where I tried to sort of move it more in a harm reduction direction. And after that, I had different opportunities to found harm reduction-oriented news sites, as you say, first Substance.com and latterly The Influence. But Filter, for me, is something completely different because it's a non-profit organization. It's an organization that we created independently. We're not owned by anyone else. And so this is I see it as a chance to fulfill the mission that I've been developing over many years, and to do it the way I and my colleagues want to. And so that's a great privilege. It's a responsibility I take seriously. And with many allies, we're very happy with the start we've made.
Yeah, so I think the nonprofit model seems to be working out fairly decently. Ad-driven journalism is totally dying. And so, all of us, we all have a career writing about drugs, and we all cover it from a harm reduction perspective. And this is such a niche, but it's also totally 100% relevant right now. And because of the fervor around the opioid crisis, we've all of a sudden become mainstream, right? But the sort of old habits of the mainstream media toward covering drugs, I think a lot of the problems and stigmas are coming out in a lot of the reporting, and Filter so clearly avoids so many of the pitfalls, and we can just run down all these myths and bad things. But one thing I wanted to start off with you, Will, is the first piece I ever read on Filter was by Tessie Castillo, and the headline is "The Invisible Majority, People Whose Drug Use is Not Problematic." And she profiles the lives of many, many drug users who are relatively functional, and they describe how drugs actually help them, and they don't fit into the extreme stories of severe use that constantly dominates the media, whether it's Intervention or New York Times Magazine profiling Kensington, where Chris lives. They called it the Walmart of heroin, and just very much zoomed in on the most problematic hardcore drug use. And to me, this is where Filter fundamentally departs from other journalism, which it does not have any implicit or explicit assumptions that drugs and sex work and harm reduction are just somehow deviant or these root evils. And can you sort of talk about that divergent philosophy?
Thank you. I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to. It's a very central part of our mission, to approach drugs without the assumption that drugs are bad. There's something that I think of as the clinician's error, whereby people who work in healthcare have a distorted view of people's health because they come into contact with people who disproportionately have health problems, and you can extend that to drugs and the addiction treatment industry, whereby people who work in those fields, because they come into contact with people experiencing problems related to drugs, might assume that is the norm for people who use drugs. Of course, we know it isn't. There's all kinds of data ranging from the UN office on the UNODC showing that actually an estimated 80 to 90% of people who use drugs do not do so in seriously problematic ways. And I think it's always so important to operate with an awareness of that. And of course, most media do not. And it's understandable, because disasters make news stories. They're clicky. People want to read them. If the only story is people are doing drugs and they're absolutely fine, it isn't really a story in many people's eyes. And of course, there's also a lot of inherent prejudice against drugs, whereby it's sort of unacceptable for a lot of people to promote a message that doing drugs might be okay. It's something that I wrestle with, and thank you for your kind words about Filter's approach. But certainly we run lots of stories about overdose, about addiction, about the different problems that people experience related to drug use, and those stories are important. 70,000 people dying every year. Every single one of them matters, and most of those deaths are completely preventable if only we had better drug policies. It's not something we're going to stop covering, but we always seek to operate with an awareness that a lot of people have non-problematic or even beneficial relationships with drugs. The Tessie Castillo piece he referenced was actually the Billboard story that I chose for our launch when we first went live. And that was a very deliberate decision to highlight that, look, it is true simultaneously that lots of people have severe problems related to drugs, but also that the vast majority of people who use drugs do so non-problematically, and we always need to approach it with that awareness. And so, mixed in with stories about overdose and other severe problems, we do have drug positive stories where people talk about experiences. There's one on, for example, LSD on our homepage at the moment, and how somebody took it and found that it actually was a seminal moment for them in coming to terms with their sexuality. And so it's, if we're going to cover this field accurately and rationally, we always have to do so with an acknowledgement that this large population, this invisible majority, as we called it on Tessie's story, is there, and that their stories matter too, because ignoring those stories actually fuels the kind of prohibitionist and draconian policies that we all oppose.
Will, I have to ask you about a tough subject that accompanied sort of the launch of Filter, and that is the controversy surrounding some of your funding sources. People like Kevin Sabat of Smart Approaches to Marijuana took issue, or umbrage, I should say, with the fact that some of your funding comes from tobacco sources. And I wonder how that may have affected your attitude towards the launch, or your confidence, and what your response to that is. Transparency is obviously important. It certainly hasn't affected my willingness to participate and be a columnist for the publication. I think I tweeted at the time, if Donald Trump gave me money to write whatever I want, I would accept that too. So can you comment on that?
Sure thing. I mean, as a non-profit, we accept donations and grants from kind of three different pots, if you like, which is private individuals who kindly support us, companies, commercial companies, and grant-making foundations. And we have sort of broadly similar amounts of support from those three different pots. We talked about accepting tobacco funding, or funding from tobacco companies. The reason they wanted to fund us, I should point out, is that for many years in publications long before Filter, my colleagues and I have firmly supported tobacco harm reduction in the form of vaping products, in the form of snus and other smokeless tobacco products. It's arguable that these harm reduction interventions have greater potential than any other in the world to save lives. I think that's absolutely true, given, for example, if you look at the numbers, about 500,000 people in the US die every year from smoking related causes, a figure that dwarfs even the number who are losing their lives to drug overdose. And so it's absolutely makes sense to me that getting these products into the hands of more smokers is completely consistent with the ethics of harm reduction, and morally incumbent upon us to do so. With that in mind, we have accepted funding from companies that manufacture vaping products. We disclose it fully on our site. We're not ashamed of it. We have a sort of a firewall in place and a policy stated on our website. None of the companies, or indeed other individuals or foundations that support us, have any say in our editorial decisions. And the editorial decisions are consistent with what we've done before. And we believe that the work that we do stands on its own feet to be seen as ethical and in line with saving lives. And that's something we're comfortable with. We are aware, of course, that some people might write off anything we publish because of the sources of some of our funding. And that's a price that we have to pay for existing and for operating in this way. I'll note that the biggest critics of this sort of funding have been people like Kevin Sabat and his former colleagues at the ONDCP. And so, I think that tells you something. My response to anybody who is critical of that aspect of things would be, well, look at the work and argue with the work if you disagree with it. I think it stands up, and I'm proud of it, and I don't feel ethically conflicted. I think that the work we're doing is helpful and as I say, in the business of promoting public health and saving lives.
On the note of Kevin Sabet, hey, Chris, remember when you reported the piece for the Daily Beast about DuPont, how he was like basically a rule maker in the federal government that was basically saying, hey, everyone needs to be drug tested. And this guy like had a bunch of stake in drug testing companies.
Yeah.
And like Sabat was like going up to bat for this guy on Twitter when that piece came out, just be like, oh, but like he divested, like he doesn't have any stake in that anymore. And like, so just like it's rich when like something like, okay, a vaping company, vaping products, like whatever, like it's not like, you know, Will, you're writing press releases for the newest like Juul pods or something like that. Like it's not like you're promoting products, but like people like Sabat and DuPont, like they actively take a lot of money from the law enforcement industry, no doubt, and they're funded interests. And of course, they're interested in enforcing laws which prohibit cannabis.
And I should point out that Sabat, who I was disappointed actually not to get a chance to meet him at the Penn conference that was rescheduled. He was supposed to be there. They sent somebody in his stead. You know, I'm always interested in talking to the, you know, quote unquote opposition. I think in most situations, we all probably have more in common than we have in difference. And I think that's important, you know, to meet people face to face and talk. But, you know, Kevin was speaking from a position of a person who is, you know, part of an organization in Florida called Drug Policy Institute. It's out of, I don't want to get the wrong university, so I'm not going to name it. You can look it up, on which DuPont is a senior advisor, and they've been completely untransparent about where their money comes from. And yet they have strong influence on Florida politics, including Pam Bondi's, you know, pushes to crack down. Well, it's just, I think they launched in 2012, but they were trying to get, you know, the welfare testing, drug testing for welfare recipients, where, you know, here in Philadelphia, we have a bill that's trying to unwind that even for parolees, you know? So, you know, it's a very, Kevin is part of the small nucleus of the last of the drug war hawks, you know, so to speak. And he wasn't completely transparent himself, even in his criticism.
Yeah, I will say, you know, everything that you say about the funding sources of those people is true. On the other hand, you know, my defense of our funding sources is not to point at other people and say, hey, well, they're doing even worse things, because I don't think that would be a very I think it's more that it's telling when people want to discredit tobacco harm reduction articles based on the sources of their funding, rather than and those, it's not specific funding for those articles, I should add, rather than actually engage with the content and explain why they think that products that are safer than cigarettes by orders of magnitude should be harder to get hold of than cigarettes. I would love somebody to explain that to me, and I've never heard a convincing answer.
And this is an argument that's been made around even drug decriminalization, hard drug decriminalization, and I think it applies to tobacco products. As a smoker off and on myself throughout my life, you know, the powers that be it the tobacco companies, the lobbying firms, the tax law, has made it illegal to go buy one cigarette. And much like the drug culture, if you're going to risk going into an illicit market where you risk robbery, assault, arrest, you're going to buy as much as you could possibly afford. You're not just going to, you know, so we incentivize, you know, if I wanted to have one cigarette, I was required to buy 20. And that it incentivizes, you know, overconsumption in a way, you know, the way that our policies are set up. And I think that so much of the discussions that we have really circle back to policy decisions that counteract the stated goals that many policymakers, spin in their rhetoric.
Absolutely, I agree with you.
Let's talk about drug literacy and media. As Zach mentioned, the opioid crisis or the overdose crisis has really brought drug use to the mainstream. It's a thing that you cover every once in a while when there's a juicy story of a drug bust or a string of overdoses or something. But a lot of legacy media, especially broadcast media, don't really get nuance of covering drugs. I want to go through some examples. One of the major problems is, journalists will only talk to cops. And I found in my own reporting, it's really effective if you're covering a drug and you literally just talk to drug users, ask them why they actually are using drugs. And you get so much more out of it that way. But that's something that a lot of journalists ignore, or they only talk to people that are in so-called recovery that have, ruined their lives and drugs were a part of that, and they've gotten through the other side, and now they only have, horror stories to tell. So what are some other things that journalists really get wrong when it comes to drug literacy?
Well, I don't know how long we've got today, but I can make a start on a few of them. I think that that authorities should have the right to determine what people put into their own bodies. That's one of them. There's the assumption that drugs are bad and that it's natural for them to be illegal, ignoring the fact that prohibition is, as we know, a fairly modern invention, and hopefully that won't be around for too much longer. There are things like the choice to continually cover seizures of large quantities of illicit drugs without actually dwelling on the consequences, if any, of doing so. I think it should be mandatory as a journalist, if you're reporting on a seizure, to say, well, what effect will this have on the illicit drug market? We know that it doesn't make drugs go away, but as Chris has brilliantly explained on Filter, it does create sort of power vacuums and promote instability and violence within illicit markets. So there's all of that stuff, the sort of the faulty assumptions and the spreading of myths. And of course, there's a lot of prejudice and stigma as well, and some of it subtle and some of it not subtle. That you've got racism all over the place, and particularly, for example, in the portrayals of drug dealers and innocent white victims. Tessie Castillo has written another great piece for Filter about why drug dealers are the wrong people to blame for the crisis, and it all feeds into the portrayal of typically people of color as sort of predatory or there to get rich, when really most street level drug dealers, as Chris has described in his reporting on Philly, don't make very much money at all, and often use drugs themselves and are just trying to get by with limited alternative opportunities. You've got gender stigma, you've got prejudice against mothers, particularly who use drugs. You've got prejudice against people from low income backgrounds. You've got prejudice against drug users. You've got the framing of harm reduction as a kind of a fringe modality still, a lot of the time, even though it's accepted in many other places around the world as a gold standard, and it has so much decades of evidence supporting it. And I do think that's I have to say a particularly American problem in the certainly in the Western world, and sort of linked into going back to the temperance movement and the formation of AA, and this idea that the only acceptable response to potentially problematic drug use is to be abstinent, and I think that still lingers in the US to an extent that makes it particularly difficult here for people to get their heads around harm reduction. And I should say, because I've been accused many times in the past of being anti-abstinence. I'm absolutely not. I have many close friends and colleagues who are abstinent from particular drugs or from, I won't say all drugs because I don't know many people who don't do caffeine, but from, broadly abstinent. And that's great. People have to make their own choices and do what works for them. What I am against is abstinence only attitudes, the idea that you're not clean, that you're not in recovery, that you haven't addressed your issues and addictions unless you're abstinent. I think that's very harmful in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, I think your point about highlighting things that are like uniquely American is very much on point. And the paradox that I always run into is like Americans are obsessed about freedom, and they equate their freedom with freedom to consume or what they buy, like freedom to own, carry, and buy and sell weapons. Like these are key freedoms for America. And so when it comes to like I don't know, a tax on soda, or like Michael Bloomberg in New York, he tried to ban cups of soda bigger than 16 ounces or some shit. I don't know what happened, but it failed spectacularly because everybody loves to consume things that they know are bad for them, and they want the freedom to fucking do it. But on the other hand, and this is where we get into like the temperance movement and cannabis prohibition and all these other things that Americans are prohibited from consuming, is you need a moral argument. You need an argument that by consuming this, you're going to harm people other than the user. It's never about protecting the safety and health and lives of end users. It's always like, if you drink, you're going to drive and kill my family. So like that's an obvious moral bad, right, for the public. But if you use heroin, they need to come up with a moral argument that's like a danger to the rest of us. And so this is where we get into just insanely inflated moral panics that are constantly following drugs. And that to me is like what is so uniquely American about prohibition.
Agreed. And I think that an important aspect of this is also conceptions of what addiction is. I think it's incredibly instructive to remind ourselves that people become addicted to all kinds of experiences that don't involve drugs, gambling, sex, shopping, all kinds of things. And what does that tell us? It tells us, I think, that while certain drugs are very pleasurable or comforting and perhaps might incline people more to develop compulsive relationships with them, it also says that addiction is not something that is inherent to the properties of drugs. It's rather about people's relationships with their lives and their psychosocial circumstances. And in a country where there is a great deal of poverty, where there is a great deal of inequality, where there is a great deal of racism and other social issues, my feeling about it is that if it weren't opioids or if it weren't some other drug, it would be something else, because people develop compulsive relationships as a way of comforting themselves against the hardships and the rawness of life. And I think it's very important to remember that when we're talking about banning soda or banning this and that. Firstly, we know that on a practical level, prohibition doesn't work, but also it's like, well, do you really think you're going to solve addiction by taking away one particular thing? It's actually far more deeply rooted than that. And I think that's important to remember.
There would be a huge black market for Coca-Cola. Like people would like mix up and concoct the most fucked up formulas to peddle Coca-Cola. you can't ban it.
and certainly with Diet Coke, I would be a frequent customer of that market, and and it would just make it more dangerous, because you'd get sort of Diet Coke hooch and
there's already so many fucked up chemicals in that. Who knows what the moonshine version of Diet Coke would.
Right, maybe it would get safer, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I'd like to point out that even the Taliban has been unable to keep cigarettes from, coming into their territory, and Al Qaeda and ISIS, particularly, went on a rampant anti-smoking campaign where I'm sure the punishments were pretty severe, and even that wasn't enough. But looping back to the to what you said, Will, we have this image of either you're either addicted or you're clean, right? So and I think a lot of that is a function of what was a necessary step in the direction of progressive drug policy, and that was the acceptance of substance abuse disorder as a disease. However, in taking out all willpower and all discipline and all self-control from the argument, you've sort of made it, you've created, an environment in which, a disease must be cured. There is no, I'd just like to have like a little bit of cancer. So I think the messaging around that as a progression, it has certainly, helped evolve the discussion in a way that provides more compassion for drug users and has relieved some of the stigma. It's swung the pendulum a bit too far the other way, and it's left no room for healthy drug use. And I'd like to point out regularly that we know what healthy alcohol use looks like versus unhealthy alcohol use. We don't have that dialogue around drugs because we consider substance abuse or substance use as in any sense of a problematic on its face. And if you'd like to respond to that, or if you have anything to add.
Well, just one thing, I know for a fact that so many journalists in New York regularly do cocaine, or they take speed or amphetamine or some other thing.
No.
Like there is totally right. Like people in media are so fucked up all the time, I swear. But there's totally an experience that a lot of people have around a lot of drugs that aren't, problematic, but even in their own experience, that doesn't filter into the way it gets reported. That's why Filter, I think, is doing such an incredible thing, because it is cutting through so much of the noise having an editor, not having to fight with an editor about a certain implicit assumptions is already so much stress off the back of anyone who's reporting about drugs.
Well, thank you. I try not to fight too much with my contributors, although perhaps Chris and Troy will tell you otherwise. But a lot to unpack in what you and Chris just said. I agree with Chris that that the disease model of addiction is really a double-edged sword. You can understand that with many people it's coming from a place of compassion, but I think that there is research as well that shows that that medicalizing conditions does in itself promote stigma. So that's one thing. You can see why the disease model is very attractive to a lot of people as well, because if you can say, well, my addiction, it's a disease, it's an external thing for which I have zero control. It does sort of excuse one from responsibility. I think a sort of a more realistic way of looking at it is that addiction is an experience that is bound up with aspects of one's life, and requires working on and improving different aspects of one's life that people do have agency, even though it is an extremely difficult and horrible thing to go through at the same time. But I think, as you both were alluding to, it's very helpful to think of drug use in terms of spectrums, that it isn't just either you're addicted or you're not. It's a spectrum of ranging from completely non-problematic to very problematic use. And it's just sort of helpful to think of it that way. For example, while we suffer tens of thousands of opioid-related deaths every year, tens of millions of Americans use those drugs every year. And so it's very serious, the problems that we're experiencing, and yet it is only a fraction of the whole. And to give a personal example of spectrums of use, when I had surgery a few years back, I was prescribed opioids and I took them and I enjoyed them greatly. I thought it was a wonderful feeling. But then when I ran out of my prescription, I stopped using them. So is that problematic? I don't think so. But there are so many different degrees of use, and it's not just about the quantity that you use, it's about how you use it and the effect it has on you. And it's just much more complicated than either saying, well, you have a problem or you don't.
That's a really good point. What I'd like to ask next is what kind of drug literacy we'd like to see from publications. How would we like to see drug use covered in the mainstream media, because it gets it wrong so often? What kind of world do we want to have? I mean, there are a lot of different answers to that, and ranging from coverage that is not prejudiced and stigmatizing to coverage that sort of front loads the experience of people who actually use drugs, as you referenced earlier. I think one aspect of that, and something I would like to see more of, although I understand why we don't, is that we have lots of well-known figures, celebrities, coming out and saying, well, I previously had a problem with drugs, but now I no longer use them. We have very few people, for understandable reasons, coming out and saying, I currently use illicit drugs, whether problematically or non-problematically. Of course, that makes sense because there are punitive consequences for admitting drug use, all kinds of negative implications for people. But I think that those, spokespeople, if they are in a position to come out, and I'm thinking, for example, now of Carl Hart, who has been open in various articles, including one for one of my former publications, about his use, non-problematic use of illegal drugs. For example, crystal meth. He wrote a piece about how he tried that. I think it's, and sort of feeding into the idea of portraying the whole of drug use and not just the most traumatic and damaging forms of drug use. I think that's a key part. I also think that, perspective is needed rather than just sort of blindly parroting law enforcement sources or reporting on drug seizures. I think it is incumbent on journalists who want to cover this seriously and well to step back and look at the bigger picture, look at the limited time period for which we've had prohibition and what came before it and why the world didn't end then, and to look at consequences of actions as we previously referenced, that clamping down and locking up one particular group of drug dealers is not going to stop the supply of illicit drugs. It's going to just displace it and probably cause turmoil and violence. It's about looking at consequences, for example, the iron law of prohibition, whereby suppliers are incentivized to produce more potent forms of drugs if they're doing so in an illegal market. So I think that that sort of looking at the bigger picture, front loading directly impacted people and cutting out all the prejudice and leaning on science and the efficacy of harm reduction, I think that those things would obviously be a good start. We could go on a lot more.
One reason why I think Filter is successful on that front in ways that legacy publications aren't is just by looking at the bylines, like looking at who Filter publishes. Like I recognize so many names from the harm reduction community, and a lot of these people are sources who have come to me with stories or people I've interviewed. Like I know a lot of them, and it's not that like they don't have the writing skills or the expertise or the talent to get an op-ed in the New York Times or the Atlantic or whatever. There's sort of like a gatekeeper problem where they're not really going to, I don't know, like Kat Humphreys talking about why we need to care for injection wounds or why we need to look at benzodiazepines in conjunction with opioids. People like Kat I see as experts in their field, and yet I don't see them getting column inches in the publications like like the Times, like I was mentioning. And so I really see Filter as like providing a space for people who I consider the experts, but in the sort of status of information, they're not being interviewed or they're not getting op-eds like out there. So like I think it's about who Filter is publishing.
That's exactly how I see Filter as well, as a place where people whose voices aren't necessarily amplified elsewhere can be amplified. I must say I'm just continually humbled and grateful by just the resources that there are in this field in terms of extraordinary people. You're talking about experts with deep academic knowledge, people like Kat, who you mentioned, who are just doing this work on the front lines and doing amazing work. You're talking about marginalized and directly impacted people whose voices aren't heard enough elsewhere. And really all I'm doing as the editor-in-chief is sort of surfing on these other people's talent and expertise and bravery, and it's those people who make Filter what it is. And I'm just extremely grateful that there are so many inspiring folks.
And so much of it has to do with sheer resources. This is just not a topic. The media business has changed so much that publications are pushing out, 700-word pieces a day, when to really tell the story of the overdose crisis, you need to be out there immersed, and frankly, it's really impossible to do without, I believe, nonprofit and foundational philanthropic resources these days. It's not a viable business model. People want the sensationalism. We focus on the worst of the worst. Well, that's because it's not really. I've gone and tested the political consultant's cocaine, his 8-ball, and it's not really exciting to go and see a nice house with a big TV and a guy that just snorts a little coke, and that's not going to sell. That's not selling the message, right? So, so much of what we do is media criticism, and the media business has changed so much that even real wars, we don't have foreign bureaus anymore. We've left that to people of their own devices. I spent the day with a producer yesterday that's doing a documentary on his own dime. So any criticism that comes back of where any money's coming from, I'd happily take money from anyone that would give me the freedom to correctly cover this, because it's just resources is such a huge component of this. And so, I hope you'll be around for a long time, Will. I hope Filter will be around for a long time, because it's much needed. And as everyone else has pointed out, you've managed to create an amazing stable of writers that are putting out some really great work. You'll have a piece from me today.
Are you late on deadline, Chris?
Yeah, I've been, yes. But I've also been, talking to detectives and DAs and all kinds of crazy other stuff. So,
well, I don't want to give Chris a hard time, because his stuff is always worth waiting for, and the on the ground coverage that he does is such an important element of this. And what you were saying, Chris, about resources is true. And another resource I want to mention is our readership. People who are deeply committed to these subjects, who really are knowledgeable about them and care about them, and who give us the space and the audience to cover some of these subjects in depth that aren't getting out there in traditional media. And so that's very important too.
Not to be like the wet blanket, right? But how much are we preaching to the choir, right? So I just did a panel at Penn, and everybody there was pretty much on the same page. I don't think anybody learned anything terribly new. I think everybody's mind was kind of made up, or they wouldn't have been there. It's a self-selecting audience to some extent. How do we get to the next? How do we get the message to the masses, and actually change the messaging rather than just sort of, write the same story a different way that our colleagues are going to read and the harm reduction community will read and agree with. And we all know that already, so that's been a conundrum of mine. I've tried to use Twitter to the extent I can do that, but even that is self-selecting in a way. I wonder how you would answer that.
It's a very good question, and if I knew a simple answer, then I would be a happy man. But I will say that I've seen signs of it coming. It's something that we're very conscious of at Filter, is sort of writing to a specialized audience, but also mixing that in with stories that are accessible, that don't assume that everybody knows what harm reduction is or why it works. It's about tackling the mainstream subjects. I don't know off the top of my head. There was one article about Lindsay Lohan that sort of blew up on Google, and I'm sure that the people reading it weren't committed harm reductionists, but it's about giving people a way in by talking about subjects that they recognize and sort of allowing the ideas of Filter to sort of seep through by osmosis in some cases. And I've seen, so yes, we have a core audience of committed activists and experts in harm reduction and people who are knowledgeable about it for other reasons. But I've also noticed social media sharing from people across the political spectrum. And, something that gives me more pleasure than anything else doing this job is when I hear from people who didn't originally agree with us and who tell us that they've actually been rethinking their positions. There's one woman I know socially who is a Republican from the Midwest and quite sort of traditional conservative in some ways. And she told me that she read one of our articles about sex work, and after doing so, really rethought her position on that and now favors decriminalization where previously she didn't. And I get emails from people I've never met or heard of before, sometimes telling me similar things, and not as many as I would like, but it's a sign to me that we're beginning to make progress in fulfilling our mission by reaching people who didn't already agree with us and hearing that they now do. I don't think there is any element of my job which gives me more pleasure and satisfaction than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of reaching audiences outside of the proverbial choir, I don't know, to me, I've written the same story about a dozen times. The story is always, there is an overdose crisis. These medications reduce mortality rates hugely, and why aren't we using them? To me, that's a story I'm dedicated to writing over and over and over again. And it's been written not just by me, but by a ton of people. And it takes, I think, all of us working together to message consistently and repeatedly and clearly. And that's just sort of the grinding and grueling, unglamorous job of doing this kind of work. And just, I think a couple days ago, the New York Times editorial board wrote, "Want to reduce opioid deaths? ? Get people the medications they need." And so we see this messaging filter into the mainstream, because I wrote that exact piece in Slate 4 years ago. So it's over time, I see all the things we're talking about slowly leak into what the mainstream discourse is. And I think it's not happening overnight, but there is a huge effect when you have people like Maya Solovitz and the Drug Policy Alliance and Filter and Herman Lopez at Vox, and just people who are day in, day out doing the work. And I think that's the commitment that this kind of movement needs.
I agree, and it is daunting, and it does sometimes seem like we're banging our heads against a brick wall. But then, if I step back and look, even the time that I've been covering this field in the past 10 years, the policy changes that we've seen are absolutely extraordinary. And while public opinion may seem entrenched, I think when you reach a tipping point, it can change very quickly, as we've seen with cannabis and with other, Good Samaritan laws, naloxone distribution, all kinds of other positive steps forward. And so we're not going to give up. And the comforting thing is that we're not doing it alone. We have so many allies, for, Narcotica and some of these amazing organizations like Drug Policy Alliance, Harm Reduction Coalition, and many others in New York and around the country and around the world. And there is a group of committed journalists who are playing a very important part in that. It is seeping through, and when you know that you're right about something, then it is just a matter of time. The trouble is, by taking time, we all know that suffering and death and mass incarceration is going on in the meantime, and so there's urgency. But I have no doubt that we'll get there, because it's just ultimately what makes sense.
What is in what do you have planned for the future for Filter? I know you have done some video work a little bit, but talk to us about what your plans are for the next year or so.
Well, we have all kinds of plans. I have so many articles on my slate. I couldn't even tell you all about them, but a couple that spring to mind is a really in-depth report about harm reduction in women and the issues, the gender specific around harm reduction delivery. We have somebody flying out to Arizona to visit a really innovative 24/7 methadone clinic and report on that. We have all kinds of, I like doing sort of these research projects. We did a big one on the position of district attorneys all over the country on drug policy, and another one on naloxone contributions, which insanely are still happening all over the country. So there'll be more of those. We'll keep doing the primarily written content and building up our audience and our collaborations in that way. We will be producing more video, and I think that other than just sort of growing as a journalistic website, I think probably in the future of Filter, it'll be more of a kind of an all-purpose harm reduction hub, providing or sort of at least linking to services. Perhaps there will be more media diversity, not so heavily predominantly written content, and so we'll expand in size, but we'll also expand in vision. That's my hope for it.
Long live Filter, as we should all be saying. Yeah, I think this is a good place to wrap up. Will, thank you so much for your time and for dedicating your career to this, because there's a million other things someone like you could be doing, and it's clear reading the influence and substance and now Filter that you just really give a shit about people who are fighting for their lives.
Well, I do, and thank you for having me on the show. I really, in turn, admire the work that the three of you are doing. And if you'll forgive me a very shameless plug, just to sort of mention,
plug away.
filtermag.org is where your listeners should come to check out the work that we're doing, and we hope they'll stay. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Narcotica. Narcotica is an independent production by Christopher Moraff, Zachary Siegel, and myself, Troy Farah. Our co-producer is Aaron Ferguson, and our theme music is by Glassboy. You can follow us on Twitter at Narcocast or on narcocast.com. If you like the program and you want to support us, there are a few ways you can help. Tell a friend about us. Most podcasts become popular via word of mouth, or give us a decent rating on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Second, you can become a patron at patreon.com/narcotica, where you'll get access to exclusive bonus content and help us pay our bills a little bit. We are so grateful for the people that make this program possible. We want to stay ad-free, and you guys help us do that. Thank you so much. If you want to send us a suggestion, tell us about using DXM to time travel, or just want to say hi, you can email us at tips@narcocast.com. That's all for now. Take care.